Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brady, other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Let me thank you for this opportunity to appear before you. The question I have been asked to address is whether we have the appropriate processes and institutions that will allow the United States and the EU to ensure the continued prosperity of the transatlantic economy and generate effective transatlantic leadership in a new global economy. My response is that we have a real opportunity to take steps forward through two mechanisms: the Transatlantic Economic Council and a stronger partnership between the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament. We are asking this question at a time of change in the U.S.-EU relationship. With the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, the EU will have new processes in several policy areas, including trade, and the Parliament will have a greater say in most legislation. The EU has, of course, had a long-time role in European trade policy, but in the past, national governments retained control over some elements of trade. That is now exclusively an EU matter, with member states only able to use a veto in certain limited areas, such as cultural exclusions and audiovisual materials. The Lisbon Treaty has also given the EU responsibility in most areas of investment policy, simplifying a situation in which competence over regulations was split between the EU and member states. Let me first turn to the Transatlantic Economic Council. You are all aware that many transatlantic trade disputes are really differences over regulations, as my colleagues have noted. Since its creation in 2007, the TEC has struggled to establish itself as an effective mechanism in resolving these regulatory differences. By the end of the Bush administration, it had reverted to discussing long-standing trade disputes, and the initial meeting of the TEC during this administration was mistimed, as many of the European participants were effectively lame ducks. The next meeting of the TEC, which is expected this fall, will be crucial. If the TEC is to become an effective mechanism for addressing regulatory differences, the agenda must be chosen with great care. The issues must be ambitious, and they must resonate with key stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic so that the TEC can begin to build supportive constituencies. We would suggest three strategic issues: promoting economic recovery and growth with a focus on building green economy and boosting innovation. 2, coordinating approaches to global economic governance, effectively becoming an informal G2 for U.S.-EU discussions prior to the G20, including on financial regulation. And 3, pursuing specific projects aimed at reducing regulatory differences, especially on those areas of emerging industries and technologies where little regulation yet exists. But for the TEC to succeed, it must also expand the circle of those engaged, especially by bringing in key legislators, including relevant committee and subcommittee leaders. This brings me to the second mechanism which must be developed: a strong and cooperative relationship between the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress. In the past, both Congress and the European Parliament have passed measures that created barriers to transatlantic economic interaction. It is time to acknowledge that if legislative bodies can be part of the problem, they must also be part of the solution. None of the existing obstacles that must be overcome, tariffs, regulations, investment barriers, can be addressed without the cooperation of legislators. Since the passage of last fall of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has established a small office in Washington charged with building stronger Congress-EP relations. In addition, I would suggest that as the European Parliament office in Washington takes shape, Congress should strongly consider whether to establish an office in Brussels. Congress should not rely on the U.S. mission to the EU as its interlocutor with the European Parliament. Congress cannot, of course, establish multiple offices with parliaments around the world, but the European Parliament is establishing a role comparable to Congress in trade, economic, and regulatory policy, and is worthy of special consideration. The transatlantic legislators' dialogue needs to be enhanced. The co-chairs, Representatives Shelley Berkeley and Elmar Brok, should be applauded for bringing new energy to the dialogue. There's a continuing need for a forum in which members of Congress and the EP can talk about a range of issues. But this should be supplemented by a committee-to-committee structure with an emphasis on non-foreign policy matters, in which the chairs of relevant committees regularly consult. The committee structures of the two bodies are quite similar, with many covering the same topics: agriculture, energy, international trade, civil liberties, etc. The Congress and European Parliament should become an integral part of the TEC. Legislators should develop a regular mechanism for identifying pending legislation that is relevant and should be examined more closely in the TEC. These same legislators could provide a regular assessment of tech progress in priority areas and build this into their oversight procedures of relevant regulatory agencies. But it's not enough to talk about process, and I want to very briefly mention 4 areas where I think European Parliament and congressional conversations could take place. Obviously, the 2 legislative bodies cannot directly negotiate, but they can establish a context. The first is one that has been mentioned by a couple of my colleagues, and that is an effort to negotiate a U.S.-EU bilateral free trade agreement aimed at the reduction of tariffs and quotas. I think this would actually be more politically acceptable in the United States, since Europe is, after all, a high-wage area with high environmental and labor safeguards. Secondly, removing the barriers to mutual investment with a particular focus on what kind of national security safeguards should be around. There is no CFIUS-like process in Europe, and this is an opportune time with the European Union trying to find its way as the new holder of competence on investment policy to explore that area with your parliamentary colleagues. Supporting the development of a transatlantic defense market. The EU is becoming far more important in terms of the defense markets in Europe, having begun to erode the national security exclusion that has long kept the EU out of that market. Combined with the lack of defense, or the austerity that will affect European defense budgets, there will be many changes in the coming years, and this is a good time for a Parliament-Congress conversation on this. Finally, agricultural policy. There will be little opportunity for agricultural reform in Europe before the French election in 2012, but after that, there will be negotiations about the next financial perspective in Europe very quickly, finishing in 2013. The common agricultural policy is the largest part of the EU's budget, and there will be a lively debate. It is a good time for members of the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress to discuss what they think about agricultural policy for the future. Thank you.